We shift gears slightly as we introduce Magdalene Jeruto, who was finished today's coronation. Sanya China Cheru, Kenya's reigning beauty queen from the county of Elgeyo Marakwet, warded off stiff competition to make it to the top 5 on her first attempt at the world crown. She'll be joining us later on in the final hours of Citizen Extra. But before that, our guest analyst in the studio this morning, I'm joined by Gabriel Muthuma, who is a political analyst. We're also joined by Mwenda Mijue, who's a security expert. We're also joined by Alutalala Mukhwana, an advocate, and we're also joined by Ababu Namamba, former Budalangi Member of Parliament. Gentlemen, good morning. Before that, we want to get the Supreme Court ruling yesterday. Let's listen into what Chief Justice David Maraga had to say.
Were filed on the 6th of November 2017, both challenging the election of Honorable Uhuru Kenyatta as President of the Republic of Kenya. Their petition numbers 2, which was filed by Honorable Aaron Mwau, and number 4, which was filed by 2 voters, Mr. Njonjo Mue and Mr. Khalif. Because of the time pressure, the 2 petitions were consolidated and heard together. But the parties were each allowed to submit on the issues which they raised in their respective petitions separately. The judges of this court thereafter retired to deliberate upon the issues raised in those petitions, which we want to summarize as follows. Before I summarize the issues, we were left with like 2 days after the hearing. So it was basically impossible to write a full judgment. What I'm going to read this morning is a determination of the judges have reached on those 2 petitions. Petition number 2 raised the following issues. Whether the first respondent was required to conduct fresh nominations prior to the presidential election held on the 26th of October 2017, and what steps were required to be undertaken, if at all. That's issue number 1. Issue number 2, were the nominations conducted for the presidential candidates for the elections held on 8th August 2017 valid after the nullification of that presidential election by the Supreme Court in its decision delivered on 1st of September 2017. When were the elections held on the 8th of August 2017 deemed to have been concluded? Did another electoral cycle commence? Issue number 3, what is the impact, if at all, of the defined time frame provided under Article 140, Sub-Article 3 of the Constitution for the holding of a fresh election on the conduct of nominations? How is this comparable with the other forms of presidential elections contemplated in the Constitution? Issue number 4, what is the effect of a declaration of invalidity of the presidential election under Article 140 of the Constitution? What are the criteria for qualifying candidates to participate in a fresh election? Number 5, are the first and the second respondents guilty of disobedience of the Supreme Court order to conduct the fresh election strictly in accordance with the Constitution and the applicable law? Those are the issues raised in petition number 2. In petition number 3, number 4, these are the issues that were raised in that petition. What is the locus standi of the petitioners? And are they persons in terms of Article 140, sub-Article 1 of the Constitution? That is, are they persons entitled to file a petition? And if so, are their petitions properly filed as public interest litigations? Number 2, what is the legal effect of the withdrawal of a presidential election candidate before election? Did any of the presidential candidates validly or properly withdraw from the presidential election held on the 26th of October 2017? Number 3, did the first and second respondents conduct the presidential election held on the 26th of October 2017 in strict conformity with the Constitution and the applicable laws? Number 4, did the election conducted on the 26th October 2017 meet the constitutional threshold of a free and fair election under Article 81 of the Constitution? Number 5, what are the legal consequences of not holding a presidential election in each constituency under Article 138(2) of the Constitution? Are the results declared thereon valid? Was the presidential election held on the 26th of October 2017 marred with the illegalities and irregularities? If yes, what are the effects of these on the validity of the elections? Number 6, what is the effect of the Elections into brackets Amendment Act 2017 on the conduct of the presidential election held on the 26th of October 2017? Is Section 83 of the Elections Act as amended unconstitutional? Number 8, was the election held on the 26th of October 2017 and its results legitimate and credible both in law and in fact? Lastly, what orders should the court issue, including orders on costs? Those are the issues raised in the 2 petitions. Having carefully considered the above issues, the specific prayers in each petition, as well as the Constitution and the applicable laws, the court has unanimously determined that the petitions are not merited, and the final orders pursuant to Article 140 sub-Article 2 of the Constitution, as read with Rule 22 of the Supreme Court Presidential Election Petition Rules 2017, are as follows. Petition number 2 of 2017 by Honorable John Haron Mwau versus the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission and 2 others as consolidated is hereby dismissed. Petition number 4 of 2017, Njonjo Mue and another versus the chairperson of the Independent Electoral and Boundaries Commission and 3 others as consolidated is also hereby dismissed. As a consequence, the presidential election of the 26th October is hereby upheld, as is the election of the 3rd respondent. Each party shall bear its own costs. As I have stated, a detailed reasoned judgment shall be issued within 21 days of this determination in conformity with Rule 23 of the Supreme Court Presidential Election Petition Rules 2017.
And that was Chief Justice David Maraga yesterday as the Supreme Court gave its decision as regards the way forward following the repeat presidential election. To our studio conversation now before we get reactions from different parts of the country, those that were immediate, and also today what people are saying following the Supreme Court decision. Starting with you, Ababu Namwamba, has this ruling put an end to the political crisis? There have been concerns over the state of the nation. A lot of people not sure what direction the nation is headed. In your opinion, would this ruling put an end to what has been seen as a political crisis? Starting with you, Ababu.
Thank you. First of all, please allow me to join you in applauding our sister Magdalene Jeruto. In the midst of all this politics, that was one bright, a bright spot that put our country in global limelight for all the good reasons. And so something very positive. Let me start from the point that this verdict by the court has had an immediate impact across the board. There is a good feel factor that can be drawn from this verdict immediately. The National Stock Exchange index jumped 25 billion. The shilling improved 1.4 to the dollar almost instantly. And across the board, I can therefore say there was relief across the board. And that is a good thing. That's a good thing for the country to a very large extent. Now, this so-called crisis, in my humble view, I do not believe that there has been or there is a crisis of any description. And my own personal view is that the challenge this country faces is more of a political culture that is just reluctant to embrace the spirit and the realities of democracy. I was looking at the outcome of the Ghanaian election of December 2016, just a year ago. And I was looking at it was a hotly contested election between President Akufo-Addo and Mahama. The difference in the election results, Addo polls 5.7 million votes to be declared winner. And Mahama comes a very close second with 4.7 million votes. That is just over 40% of the votes cast. That is an election which, in my view, was as closely contested as the election that you may refer to in this country, whether it is in 2013 or the last one this year. But no one has talked of a crisis. No one has said, okay, now Mahama represents 40% of the Ghanaian voting populace. Now Mahama and Addo have to sit down and engage in some kind of conversation, because the Ghanaians accept the reality of democracy, that in a democracy there will be a winner and there is a loser. And that's just the reality of democracy. Now, in this country, we have reduced the election contest to a crisis, as it were, so that losing an election becomes a crisis. And so I beg to differ that with the notion that there has been a crisis of any nature. And let me conclude by saying that listening to Maraga, among the issues for determination by the Supreme Court were the legality and legitimacy of this election. And he says in terms of the law and facts. And that determination of the court therefore means that as far as legitimacy and legality of this process is concerned, the Supreme Court found absolutely nothing to take away from the legality and legitimacy of this process. So this crisis is imaginary, in my humble view. And
as Mheshimiwa there says that this crisis is imaginary, Mwenda, let's talk about the frequency and scale of violence, which is one of the characteristics that have actually bottled down to this being seen as a political crisis. The number of deaths, the violence and lawlessness, which has become the hallmark of Kenyan politics, or at least that's what the perception is. And what needs to be done about this cycle of violence that is experienced during the election period in this country?
Well, thank you very much. I, first of all, begin by congratulating the President for having been declared, the winner even by the Supreme Court. And as Mheshimiwa has said, I think we should all, as Kenyans, celebrate our Miss Kenya for doing a brilliant job in China. We look forward to having her in the show later. Something has been happening in our country the last, say, 7 years since we inaugurated a new constitution in 2010, where the whole society has had to transform to conform with a new constitution that set the bar for democracy far above anything that most of us experienced in our generation. Most of us that are of the age of voting in this country were born in the previous dispensation, where we lived under a constitution that did not espouse the tenets of democracy as today set in our constitution. Now, this election, more than any other election in Kenya's history, put to test that constitution and its efficacy and its ability to cause our survival existence, our societal existence. This democracy was stretched, this constitution was stretched to the limit. And this has also affected the security of our country. The security agencies, the police, the intelligence, the military, they were all put to a test, extreme test. Talk of, coming to the edge. This constitution stretched the judiciary, it stretched the politicians. You could ask Honorable Mtwababu, in Meru they call him Mtwababu. It stretched everybody. It stretched our feelings as Kenyans. What is our value as a nation? Today, there are Kenyans talking about seceding. Still, the constitution is stretching us to the limit. And I'll tell you, Lillian, the security agencies were part and parcel of this constitutional test. And so, today, everyone in the security sector has to ask themselves, where do we draw the line between protecting our people, protecting their rights to picket and rights to demonstrate, and protecting lives and property? This election, more than any other time, tested us, and I think we all know how much is caught.
Last week when you were here, Prof, we talked about the legitimate concerns of persons who have lost faith in the ballot. Do you feel that yesterday's decision by the Supreme Court restored this faith?
Lillian, my answer is really a straight no, depending on which side of the political divide you are speaking from. First of all, we must understand that the greatest challenge, I actually call it a tragedy that we have in this country, Lillian, is our politics and the politicians. In my view, the decision that was made yesterday by the Supreme Court, apart from the judicial considerations that there might be, it must be appreciated that at this point, we do not have the capacity to dissect the reasons and the grounds upon which the decision was made. Because unlike in the 1st of September decision, this one, the judges have not even given us a summary as to the reasons why they arrived at that decision. So everything else we can talk in this program is basically based on the grounds that were based in the petitions, and try and speculate on what grounds did the judges dismiss the petitions. But suffice to say, the day we were here, I expressed my fears about the mental frame of the judges. And I said that these judges are like you and I. They see what is happening in the country. They see our arguments. They see our misunderstandings. And therefore, the decision that was made for me was a very clever decision by the court.
Clever or made under duress, which is what the NASA leader responded to, reacted, saying yesterday that this decision was one that was made under extreme duress.
I choose clever. As a lawyer, I can't allege what I cannot prove. I choose the word clever in the sense that they decided, in my view, that this bed was made by the politicians. So let them go and lie in it. Because the problem that is bedeviling the country is not a legal problem per se. The problem that is bedeviling the country right now is a political problem. And since 1st of September, the court made a very good decision. And the decision was go back and comply with the constitution and the electoral laws. After that, what politicians did as they always do, they got hold of the IBC, pulled whichever directions. We are told Jubilee had 4, NASA had 2. Eventually, the NASA one took off and there was left 1. And therefore, what was presented as the rules governing the elections on the 26th were not agreeable among the opponents. So what is the result? That we went into an election that was contested, whose very rules were contested. Therefore, it is a situation that we have been brought in by the politicians. And in my view, the court has ruled rightly that the politicians sort out the mess. Because it's not a legal problem. It is a political problem. It is not right to draw a parallel between Ghana and Kenya. Because if you look at the situation preceding the elections in Ghana, there is no parallel with what preceded the elections on 26th.
But so would you want to respond to that, that there is absolutely no comparison between these two situations?
And that's why I talk to political culture. Of course, the political culture in Ghana is different from here. And I believe that is the problem in this country. It's about the political culture. Because, you see, there is a part of the political class that wishes to sort of cement that narrative of crisis. And they tried every possible machination in the build-up to this election to build up that narrative. They took 1 million cases to court prior to this election. They tried everything you could possibly try to undermine the preparedness of the IEBC to conduct this election. So for me, this crisis, if at all there is anything you can call a crisis, is stage managed. And by the way, political contests ending up in courts is not a new thing. It did not begin with Kenya, and it did not end in Kenya. The greatest democracy on the face of the earth determined the presidential contest in the year 2000 between Al Gore and George Bush in the Supreme Court. And that simply goes to prove that the fact that politicians contest an election and they end up in the courts does not mean there is a crisis. It's just the working, the mechanics of our democracy as enacted by the Constitution.
Muthuma,
why you would call that a crisis beats me.
Okay, Muthuma, let's get your reactions as we cross over to Kisumu. Ababu believes that this was a stage-managed crisis, but then again, international headlines are screaming that Kenya was at loggerheads as regards the way forward, that really there was no end in sight, and therefore, looking at the faith that has been lost in the Kenyan electoral process, if at all it has been lost. Do you feel that yesterday's landmark ruling has put an end to this?
Let me begin by saying there's one thing I am agreeing 100% with Honorable Ababu when he says it's a primitive culture. I'm actually calling it a primitive, but it is a cultural problem because we have bought into a lie that we can never have a democratic election that can produce a loser. And the minute we take this and we own it and we run with it, we preach it to our people and tell them that the only way I will lose an election is if it is stolen away from me. And we saw that from the onset. And I was so categorical when I was talking to people and telling them, you know what, you cannot go out there and tell your people that the only way this coalition or this coalition will win is if they they will steal an election or is if they will rig an election. The fact of the matter was, from the onset, these two coalitions had a mathematical chance of winning an election. So it is a culture that we have bought into, and we say, if these guys win, they will have rigged. In essence, what you're saying is that the democracy that prevails in this country, Lillian, can never produce a loser, and that is the problem. We take it, we own it, we preach it to our people. In turn, it is turned into people, you know, becoming so crazy about the idea of you are against our community, and that is why we are seeing the violence that we are seeing. Coming to answer your question, I think what the court and the judgment that we saw yesterday, albeit the fact that Wakili here, you know, is right to say we must wait and see the comprehensive judgment. People will be able to read through and see exactly why, you know, the kind of judgment that came out. But really what the center or the stage that is being set for me and you is that the court told us there was an election. That is what every Kenyan wanted to see. Was there an election or not? It was, because among the key things that were answered was the legitimacy issue came to play, the nomination issue came to play, and the articles, 81 that IEBC was struggling with, they were actually answered. And in a very simplistic way, you had judges, all of them unanimously, which is another message that is being sent, that indeed there was an election. And probably when now we look in hindsight, they say hindsight is 2020. Was there any reason for somebody to boycott an election? I think that is a topic for another day, but I think there was an election. That is what the Supreme Court actually decided yesterday.
And as we continue with this conversation, we'll be looking at the harder task for Uhuru Kenyatta to unite what has been seen as a deeply divided nation. Before that, let's get reactions from Kisumu County. There was mixed reactions from different parts of the country following the Supreme Court ruling yesterday. Let's listen into what people in Kisumu County are saying today.
Wow, sound check. Well, thank you very much, Lillian. And we are in Juakali, Kamas area to be specific, where in this area, just a few minutes ago, there was some confrontation between police and the youth. Tear gas canisters have been hurled in this place, and I can tell you for free that the atmosphere is quite laced with a very stinging tear gas fumes. And while the bone of contention here in this place that led to the running battle since morning was that there was a group of youth who are allegedly participating in the looting of one of the hardwares in this place. Now we understand that they were taken out of that place doors and tiles, ceramic tiles that is, and other materials that are involved in the entire process of house construction. Now, as you can see the street, this is the aftermath of that, and actually the action started yesterday during just after the declaration, rather the Supreme Court ruling. There was some action in this area where some shops were broken into, and we understand that some youth had made their way back to this place to come and loot a certain shop in this place. I understand the shop is right, and as you can see, people had retreated into various buildings, basically just to protect themselves from those fumes. But as you can see, the road is really littered with all manner of things. There are ceramic tiles that have been broken, there are metals and what have you, and this basically comes as action that started today morning. Yesterday also there was the same kind of action in this place, but it died down. We've seen 2 police land cruisers basically patrolling this area, and there's someone, I don't know where he's gone to. He was trying to disperse the forming crowds, but that is all in connection to yesterday's. There's some sort of spillover from yesterday's action, where yesterday there was also commotion in Kondele area, where we understand as of this morning the roads have been unblocked, and there's some traffic is moving. Well, okay, there's some confrontation also going on, Lillian. It's not entirely peaceful in this area, but the people are basically trying to keep off looters or rowdy youth that were trying to vandalize a certain shop in this place. But in Kondele, as I said, traffic is moving. The central business district, business is moving. People are going about their normal businesses. And now, of course, we'll be keeping an eye. We understand that police are coming in and out of this area. They come and they leave, they come and they leave. But of course, we'll be looking into that. We'll be following that action. I'm sorry, Lillian, if my voice is not all that clear. It's because the atmosphere in this place is not all that clear. There are some stingent fumes of tear gas. But that is basically what is going down here in Kisumu in concerns as concerns to the aftermath of the Supreme Court ruling. Lillian.
Thanks for that. Very shortly, we'll be crossing over to Eldoret. I don't know if John Wanyama is on standby, right? He is on standby. Remember, as the Supreme Court delivered its verdict yesterday, there was mixed reaction in different parts of the country. While others were separating in some parts, others were not too happy about this particular decision. And let's listen into what's happening in Eldoret.
A very good morning to you, Lillian. And here in Eldoret, unlike in Kisumu, whatever Laura has informed us, is that in Uasin Gishu is calm. And you remember yesterday, at 10 minutes Supreme Court ruling, sounded like a song in the ears of residents here in Uasin Gishu after they broke into singing and dancing yesterday, led by their governor, Jackson Mandago, who was there also their soloist yesterday. Residents here broke a record yesterday after thousands of them poured on the streets of this town, Eldoret, to celebrate the win of President Uhuru Kenyatta. And so far, Lilian, in Uasin Gishu, residents are now going on with their normal businesses, and everything is smooth, and there's nothing apart from maybe just a few people who are trying to think, talking in low tones. When the president is being when is he going to be sworn in? And generally, Lilian, the mood here in Uasin Gishu is cool. Nothing is happening like whatever Laura is telling us, it's what is happening in Kisumu. But also yesterday, leaders took that opportunity to remind residents that time has come now, that whatever has been holding them not to go on with their businesses, now it's over after a long wait, and now it's time for them to go back to their businesses and coexist as Kenyans. Since the court had made their ruling, Governor Jackson Mandago also said that this region now, despite the fact that it has supporters from NASA and the majorly supporters from Jubilee, now is time to come together as one people, as a nation. Generally, Lilian, in Uasin Gishu, specifically here in Eldoret town, whatever we have seen across the shops, supermarkets, is that residents are now shopping and window shopping for their early Christmas. Lilian.
Thanks for that. That's John Wanyama, who is in Uasin Gishu County. He's in Eldoret. It's peaceful there, and people milling around, going about with their day-to-day. Of course, that scene totally different from what we've seen in Kisumu County, where we saw some persons there having just had demonstrated, and Laura Achieng is staying with that developing story in Kisumu. Let's talk about the fact that Uhuru himself said at the time he was declared winner of the repeat presidential election that any calls for national dialogue must await conclusion at the Supreme Court. Do you think that it is imperative at this time now, let's start with you, Honorable Namwamba, once again, that he reaches out to the opposition? When we talk about national dialogue, what are the priority areas that the presidency needs to look into?
Lilian, first of all, please allow me just to have a take on the images we've just watched here, live from Kisumu, especially. Now, as a Democrat who is also familiar with the architecture of our Constitution, this stuff from Kisumu, this is not the kind of civic action contemplated by the Constitution. This is a crime. This is ordinary crime. This is ordinary crime. And this is not what anybody may want to paint as a manifestation of a political crisis. These are hoodlums who are breaking into people's businesses.
Albeit the fact that it's coming so soon after...
They're taking advantage of the situation. I can tell you for free, that is my route home. For me to get to Budalangi, I fly into Kisumu, and I drive from Kisumu airport all the way through Gunja to Bumala and then down to Budalangi. Between the gate into Kisumu airport all the way to Gunja, which is basically the last stop before you cross into Busia County, there are all these groupings of people who are stopping cars, and they're extorting money from travelers, and they're harassing people all the way along the way. There is nothing political about this. And that's why I insist that someone is determined to enact a narrative. This narrative was also reinforced by the violence and intimidation that stopped people from voting in 25 constituencies in this region. And it's now being escalated by just allowing ordinary crime to be elevated to some kind of political action. It's not, and it should be dealt. But just
going back to what happened in Babadogo, Mathare, Kibera, here in Nairobi, 6 people dead. Would you really categorize this as acts of hooliganism and just dismiss them as thievery and something that really doesn't deserve attention?
I am saying that someone is using this situation to enact or to attempt to paint the imagery of a crisis. And of course, that becomes fodder, especially for international press. For the international media, Lilian, if there is a little flare-up in Kibra, or in Mathare, that's a big thing. And that is what the Western media, excuse me, that's what the Western media would love to paint of Africa. But what I'm saying is that as far as our politics is concerned, we need to move away from this political culture where electoral contests are supposed to give us winners, winner, 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 and no loser.
I'll have you respond to my first question as I get Mwenda's thoughts on the same. The fact that these acts of hooliganism are nothing to worry about.
They should be dealt with.
Yeah, the fact that we're seeing this in Kisumu is not a replication or a representation of what is actually the mood nationwide. Do you agree with this? Is this actually cause for concern? Because like I said, there have been deaths that have been reported. Up to 15 people died when police fought Raila's supporters who had jumped various parts of Nairobi streets to welcome him back from his trip abroad. And we've recently seen politic-related attacks in Babadogo, like I said, Mathare and Kibera. Is this cause for concern, or are we slowly sliding into anarchy?
Well, what I see happening in our country, as I said previously in my earlier comment, all of us as a country have been put to test. And if you look at any nation, even those that Honorable Ababu alluded to before, the United States and recently Ghana, Gambia, elections always elicit this kind of feelings. And politicians... In Kenya, of course.
Or worldwide?
Worldwide. Politicians also have this tendency to cause what in political science is called instrumentalization or societal instrumentalization, where they hype up the feelings of the people. And now, when an election process has come to an end, like it did yesterday at the Supreme Court, quickly we should revert to cooling down these temperatures. And that's the question you asked Honorable Ababu, and he very smartly refused to answer the question when you asked him.
No, we're getting into that. He actually chose to first respond
on dialogue. I intend to answer that question.
If you asked him if you should do dialogue,
yeah,
and I think that's what the honorable member should have answered here, because this is where our country is working towards. Yes, I think we should give up these hardline positions. It doesn't matter what we just went through. These electoral processes, hype up feelings, give us emotions against each other. Maybe I was competing with Honorable Ababu, he beat me or I beat him. But now the contest is over. One of us is standing, the other one is lying down. When one is down and the other one is standing, you don't laugh and scoff at each other. It's time to embrace each other, maybe give a hand to the guy down and say, brother, this was only a contest. We are still brothers. I think that's where this country should be heading towards. And this violence and incidences of looting, and like what we're seeing in Kisumu, really, yes, it's criminal, like he said, and I absolutely agreed with him that the police must punish these criminals. However, we should ask ourselves what drove them to do that. As our reporter said, they went to a shop that apparently has been there. I mean, me and you can almost guess why a particular shop of all the shops there was targeted. Right. It has some ethnic connotations.
Okay. They've been incited. I'll go back to you, Honorable Mwamba, yes. On whether the presidency now needs to reach out to the opposition as we move forward as a nation.
Yes. First of all, let me start by congratulating His Excellency the President. This has been long coming. And now that the questions of legality, legitimacy about his election have been settled and cleared out of the air, he should proceed now and provide firm leadership for the country. Now, as far as dialogue is concerned, dialogue is an ongoing process. It's not an event. It's not something we stop and say, now we have stopped everything. Now let us dialogue. Dialogue is even contemplated within the architecture of our constitution. In fora like Parliament, the National Assembly, the Senate, the county assemblies, those are fora for continuing national dialogue. We dialogue through legislation. We dialogue through conversations around the policy direction that the country should take. So this is a continuing process. And so the president, I would expect, would want to add impetus to these processes that are inbuilt within our laws. The dialogue I have a problem with is, or rather the nature of dialogue is where you say, because this one has won an election, and this one has lost an election. Now dialogue is only when you have the loser and the winner sitting together to converse. That would then mean across the country, in all the 290 constituencies, including in Budalangi, I need to sit down with the fellow who won the election and start a dialogue with him. So that everywhere you had a winner and a loser, now they have to sit down and dialogue. That, for me, does not sit anywhere within the framework of democracy. But as far as having a conversation on issues of national interest, for instance, there is an emerging conversation, or there is an emerging issue of whether we need to take a fresh look at our constitution, whether in fact pure presidentialism as a form of government may not be really suited to our situation as a country. Maybe we should go back to the discussion of a hybrid system where you are combining the presidency and maybe some parliamentarism, some kind of if you want to start a national conversation, and this conversation can go on in the National Assembly, it can go on in the Senate, it can go on in civil society, it can go on in fora such as this. That is a conversation that is absolutely good. But if it's about dialogue, someone has lost an election, now you have to dialogue on how to include them in government or that kind of stuff. Now that you lose me. Absolutely.
Doc Lutalala, when we talk about dialogue, what will it take for all parties to be comfortable with the ultimate decision that will come out of these conversations? As you've seen, as others are celebrating, there are still those that are extremely unhappy about this verdict by the Supreme Court, and there are those who feel that dialogue would include an all-inclusive government, and that this conversation is one that must be had if we are to have an end in sight as regards the climate and the fact that people are still at loggerheads as we speak, even after the judiciary has made its stand.
Lillian, that question you're posing will earn you favorable results if the person you're directing that question to does not stand to gain from a Jubilee win, neither does he or she stand to gain from a NASA win. Because the question of dialogue is so critical, yet it is the most avoided question by both parties. When you ask a person who has a leaning to Jubilee, they outright don't want dialogue because the stakes are such that if there's a dialogue, then the lineups that have been set in terms of appointments and benefits will not go their way. And vice versa with NASA. And the quick thing that comes to your mind, which they'll bring and spring at your face, is we don't want Nusu Mkate. Contrary to the fact that the bulk of them who are ridiculing Nusu Mkate were actually beneficiaries of that Nusu Mkate into it, including some of the sitting MPs on the other side. I agree with Honorable Babu Namwamba when he says that dialogue with losers does not sit well within the frameworks of democracy. I agree. But similarly, appointment of losers to key state institutions.
I think we should put in the word election losers and not just
election,
losers.
Yes, election losers. He meant election losers. And similarly, appointment of election losers does not sit well with democracy. For instance, when you appoint a gentleman who has lost an election, and at that time he is actually facing corruption allegations, not proved yet, and put him as the Speaker of the Senate, the apex of the National Assembly of this country, that is a slap in the face of democracy. So I agree with Honorable Babu Namwamba that a discussion with losers in its proper sense is not right. However, my brother here caught it so right. Lillian, I told you last time we were here that the problem with us, we're like what hawks. We keep forgetting where we've been hit. Why are we discussing about where we are? Why are we discussing about this dialogue without asking ourselves why we are here? We are here because, as I've said, politicians have bastardized and defiled the constitutional provisions that the court ordered we should go through. And because they have messed up with that, we ought to go back and sit. I'm not so sure that the court settled both legality and legitimacy. I would want to agree that legality was settled. I would disagree with legitimacy. Because in my view, legitimacy has to do with acceptability of that particular position. There are a section of almost half the country, Lillian, who are saying they don't recognize President Uhuru Kenyatta. To me, that is a question of legitimacy. And I agree with your proposal that the first thing that President Uhuru Kenyatta must do is to reach out to those Kenyans who are saying, you are not my president. But what should be the nature of the dialogue? The nature of the dialogue should not be about dividing positions or distribution position. The nature of the dialogue should be, did we get it right with the elections of 26th? Because that's where the bone of contention is. And the Court of Appeal has not answered that, because the Court of Appeal, as I've said, was not addressing a political problem. The Court of Appeal was attempting a legal problem. So for me, there must be dialogue. Because, Lilian, if there's no dialogue, how are you going to sort out those fellows who are mourning and crying and engaging in demolition of property? Of course, Honorable Babu Namwamba is right to a certain extent that hooligans will tend to take advantage of the situation. But what is the root cause of that? And that's why a security expert is right. That we must go back to where the rain started beating us and talk to each other.
I have a different view, and I think anytime we talk about democracy, and we must understand democracy, I think the dialogue we should be talking about is diversifying our ideas. And when you talk about diversifying, majority of us Kenyans have, I told you, I began by telling you, majority of us have bought into a lie. You've just heard Wakili here talk about politicians. Politicians have just played their game, and we've been played. Every time we reach out to the national basket, who do we remove? The same politicians. So the problem is not per se the politicians, it's us. Why do we keep repeating and regurgitating the same people who are putting us to the situation that we are in? What is happening now is that bitterness has been intensified. I told you, somebody who feels I needed to be in that seat will know that I have very culpable people that I can lie to and tell them this has been stolen from us. By so doing, I know how they will act and react. So I intensify bitterness to an extent that they will not listen to anybody who's coming to them with any other idea apart from we share this. That is the number one problem. We have been played, and we need to get that. So we move the dialogue from talking about, you know, giving or taking somebody to Senate. That is neither here nor there. The debate that we should be talking is removing it from the tribalistic element, removing it from the indigeneity, indigenization, which is what we, you know, we want to be identified as, and bringing it to the national level. Ask you what, or tell you what. In a state like the US, when we like, you know, most of the time we like, you know, pointing to America as this great democracy. But really, if you look at it, it's the only place where you can have two brothers who are governors in different states, the Bush brothers. The reason is this: there is no element, as much as we talk about racism, there is no deep element of indigenization as we have in this country. That is why it is very, I mean, it's near impossible to have two brothers who are governors in two different parts of this country.
And therefore, how to demonstrate national healing and reconciliation then?
So as we move along, I think we need to start about the efficiency and skills and actually talking to our voters. They need to start understanding the epitome of democracy. We need to do a very serious civic education for people to understand that, Lilian, you can lose and you can win in an election. Yesterday I saw, before we started seeing the pictures of you know, of Kisumu, and I'm sorry to say this to my panelists here, there are places that we saw celebrations. Actually, I was watching the TV and it was all over, including Honorable Babu's area. Budalangi, guys were celebrating. Kakamega, they were. Mombasa, you had celebrations. So I do not want to point to a particular region, but we need to ask ourselves, what needs to happen in this area? Just like in Nairobi, places in Nairobi where we've seen, all right? We saw people partying. Did you hear a shop broken into? These are facts. Did you see any mayhem yesterday with people who are celebrating? No. So as much as we are talking about the efficacy of an election, we need to start asking ourselves, why are we behaving in such a primitive manner? People talking about, you know, holding themselves from investing in one area. Is this how we want to be remembered? It goes back to the ionas of leadership. Why are our people acting this way? What can we play? What part can we play? Because at the end of the day, we must focus their sights on nationalism. I think if we are starting to talk about the dialogue of nationalism, we will start getting things right.
And as we take the break, because you spoke about voters and the issue of legitimacy has come from you, Professor Lutalala, let's talk about the low voter turnout. I'm looking at 38%, and the argument is that while Uhuru Kenyatta has the constitutional mandate to lead the nation, he does not have the political mandate. I want to talk about low voter turnout and whether this is a manifestation of Kenyan politics, or rather a repeat elections, if this is a manifestation of this, whether this is a unique situation to Kenya. Professor Lutalala, when we talk about legitimacy and the concerns over the legitimacy of this presidency based on the low voter turnout, how do you handle that significant chunk including the NASA leadership, who feel that this presidency is not legitimate based on the fact that people did not turn up to vote.
Thanks, Lillian. You know, as I said, for me, legitimacy, in very simple terms, not being simplistic, but simple terms, has to do with to what extent is the president accepted across the board. And this has to be manifested in the number of the votes that he garnered. Basic rule. However, the low turnout can find various ways of being explained. The fact that the very toxic political environment at the time when we went to the election militated against a good turnout. To be frank with you, the low turnout was not only in NASA strongholds, the low turnout was even in the Jubilee strongholds because of the fatigue and discouragement that the population has with the way politicians are running this country, the way they are running their affairs. So yes, when there is a broad spectrum of voting to a number that shows a decent approval rating for the president, then you talk for legitimacy. But in a situation where you have such a low turnout, clearly you cannot claim to have the legitimacy to govern the people. Some who are openly saying, including on the president's own Twitter handle, that you're not my president. That must be something that we must address. And I personally, I think that President Uhuru Kenyatta is one guy who believes that he ought to get the loyalty and acceptability of all Kenyans across the board. The circumstances that have been driven in, some of them not his own making. Remember that it's not just about Uhuru. He has his people. He has his system. Some of the situations that the president has been driven in will require his own statesmanship to sit up and say, hey, wait a minute. Where I am, I do not think I'll be comfortable having this kind of ridicule from a section of the population of Kenya. And Lillian, once again, that brings us to the same table of dialogue. There can be no legitimacy at this point if you are just going to listen to what the Jubilee supporters are saying, forget about that, let's move on.
I see Honorable Namwamba wanting to jump right in.
I'll finish.
Lillian,
allow me to finish.
Okay, Prof. Okay.
Because as I said, what we need now is the president to sit up and talk to his opponent. Until that is done, Lillian, we'll have this mess. But of course, if you're asking a Jubilee person, he would want to hear none of it, because what is at stake? It's a job, it's a tender, it's a benefit.
Lillian, I think that is taking a very simplistic view of this scenario to look at it merely because someone holds an opinion. They're angling for a tender. Or no. There are beliefs. People hold beliefs. People have principles on some of these matters. And some of these beliefs go very deep in terms of our understanding and appreciation of democracy. Lillian, I have no doubt that President Uhuru Kenyatta is not the president of Jubilee. President Uhuru Kenyatta is the president of Kenya. He's the president of 40 million plus Kenyans.
That's constitutional.
And in his first term, you saw a president who went out of his way to embrace the nation. The president was in Kisumu. The president was in Homa Bay. The president was even in Migori when they even attempted to humiliate him in some public forum in Migori. He did not tire to continue going to all these places.
He even embraced you, Mheshimiwa.
In a very deliberate, yes, I'm part of the manifestation of that.
Who embraced him, the deputy or the president?
The president. But the point I'm making, Lillian, and this is a fundamental point, that the president has already demonstrated his willingness to reach out. And in fact, it is part of that. That reaching out is one of the reasons why in this election he performed a lot better than he did in 2013. Mutuma mentioned Budalangi. Budalangi celebrated big time yesterday. And you may want to know, for instance, that in 2013, President Uhuru got about 400 votes in Budalangi. In this last election, he got about 11,000 votes in Budalangi. That is a huge jump. And it is about going out of your way to embrace those who may not agree with you today, but you're deliberately going out of your way to include them. And the president has been very inclusive in that regard. And I have no doubt that in this second term, as the president seeks to cement his legacy, he will do even a lot more of that. I have no doubt about that.
But even as he seeks to cement his legacy, once again, just getting down to my question of the low voter turnout and what that essentially communicates about his leadership.
And I'm coming to that. And the point I want to make here is that To say that a leader of any country in a democracy can be embraced by everybody is a fallacy. It's fallacious. It can't happen. Obama, for his 8-year presidency in the US, was never accepted in large quarters of that society. Today, Trump still gulls large portions of the American populace. And that's just the reality of a democracy. There are those who will support you, there are those who will embrace you, there are those who will disagree with you, no matter what you do. That's just the reality. Now, to imagine that if, for instance, today, Uhuru sits with Raila, that will magically somehow translate into 100% acceptance across the country. That is not true. Because even as you speak today, if I were to reduce this discussion to Luo Nyanza, for instance, and say a lot of this is happening in Kisumu and not perhaps in next door Vihiga or Busia, there are a lot of Luos who are part of Uhuru Kenyatta's political infrastructure, including the Secretary General of his party. And so to say that to reduce this into merely a relationship between two people is simplifying it too far. I do agree that the president should continue the agenda that he has already set of reaching out to serve every Kenyan, which he has already done anyway. I do not agree with this notion that even the voter turnout is symptomatic of a rejection of the president. I'll be getting your response very shortly, Mwenda, and we'll be continuing with this conversation. Of course, this is Uhuru Kenyatta's last term, and as our panelists here have said, he will want to create his legacy. We'll be looking at succession politics as well. When we return